Hello folks, in today's video I'm going to show you the solution I've arrived at for producing rib stitching effect on flying surfaces. I think it achieves all that I want from the technique, and it really adds a bit of a zing and a pop to a model. So if you want to find a fairly simple approach to achieving this look, then buckle up, get your favourite tipple in hand, and let's have a look at rib stitching and taping. Well, let's get started then. First, a few words about rib stitching in general. So when these aircraft were built, the fabric, once it had been laid over the frame, was generally stitched onto the ribs to obviously prevent them from parting company. And the process was quite involved, but I think if you don't put it onto a model, it's glaringly obvious. Or let's put it another way, when it's added onto a model, I think it can really enhance the appearance of a sports scale model and elevate it to a level that it doesn't really belong to. Well, wait a moment, let's just demonstrate. So this is a flare kit, or it was built from a flare design. This is a DR1, and you can see I've added rib stitching, and it's obviously I think it's over scale, but it gives a nice look to the wing, and it's sort of enhanced by that sort of streaky finish that was quite common on the Fokker aircraft. So what I intend doing is duplicating that on this model. So the stitching on the prototype varied in the spacing between 1.5 and 2.5 inches, depending on the speed of the aircraft. Obviously, the quicker it was going, the closer together the stitching was, and in areas of the wing where there was greater strain, it was generally closer together. So it wouldn't be unusual, for example, to find the stitching towards the tips of the wing to be further apart than near the centre, where there was more forces imparted on them. The other rule is that the tape that covered the stitching was generally twice the width of that spacing. So that gives us a ballpark to go by. Now I've worked out that for this model at 1/6 scale, just to make life easy, and I was never the best at maths, I'm going to go for 1 centimetre spacing, which roughly equates around the 2 inches, 2 and a bit inches. And I think it'll be really effective there. When I've looked at reproductions of the Fokker D7, I haven't actually noticed any stitching at all on this part, and that's perhaps because of the structure, but I'll come to that later. There's definitely wing stitching, rib stitching on here, and tape on here. So that's where I'm going to demonstrate the technique that I'm going to use. So let's get started. What are the materials? Well, this is masking tape, and I think that sort of thickness is about right. Now I'm going to run out of this, but I can always cut strips off from wider material. That's going to be the first stage. I'm going to use a white adhesive, a PVA-based adhesive, to simulate the stitching. I'll be applying it with this tool, more of that in a moment. And then I've got a choice, once everything's dried, of either covering it with some iron-on covering that I have, and this is what I used when it came to covering the gypsy moth. I used this, or I may use micropore or Blenderm tape cut into strips. We'll have a look when I get to that stage. Before we actually start doing the stitching and the tape, a word about these things. These are pinking shears, and you can see they've got a triangular set of teeth, and these are actually pinking shears to a scale of 1/4. You can buy them to work at different scales. So if I wanted to, I could have got some for a 1/6 scale, but I'm not going to do that. And the reason I'm not going to do that is because, at least in the case of the German aircraft, they didn't do that. They simply ripped off strips of the cloth which was used to cover the stitching after it had been applied to the aircraft. Generally, from the research I've gone into, the pinking didn't come into widespread use until after the war, when there was pinking machines that came into operation. But in terms of the modelling, you can either approach it like this if you're doing a tiger moth, for example, but you can also get pinking wheels where you simply run them along to create the cutting edge and that jagged dog tooth edge. Perhaps the pinking wheels would be easier to use, but I have used these before. I used them on the gypsy moth that I built, and I think it looks very effective. But we don't need to worry about that because we're doing a First World War German aircraft that had straightforward strips, and that's going to make life somewhat easier. Let's crack on. So the first thing to do, I can move this out of the way, these aren't attached, is to lay the tape where it needs to go. And there's not a great deal of adhesion to this, but there doesn't need to be. And then I'm going to cut them to length later on. I do this all the way across. And when I've done that, we'll come back and I'll show you the process of applying the stitching effects. I've marked on at 1 centimetre gaps. I hope you can see that. I think you can see that now. The position for the stitching. And then what I'm going to use, I've bent a piece of wire and I've put an edge on it. You could use a scalpel blade or something similar, and I'm going to use this to pick up the glue and apply it to the tape. So we'll get that process started and then I'll show you how I do it. All set, so let's get started. I'm right-handed, so you do it left to right, otherwise you're working on top of yourself. And I'm working from the highest down to the lowest for the same reason. And you simply pick some glue up and apply it like that. Now, some of the glue will spread, don't worry about that. I did worry the first time I tried this. I was concerned it was going to look silly, but I think you've just seen with the DR1, it's very effective. When this dries out, it will shrink a little. I find you need to do 1 application per stitch. There are other methods of doing this. You can actually use real thread. Set up a frame, wrap the thread around at the same intervals, dope it to the covering that you're going to use. So you would use something like, well, you could use this polyester if you wished, or you could use nylon covering, and then you cut the strips off that you require. I think that's quite laborious, and I think the results, unless you're very careful, tend to be way over scale. We're looking for a subtle effect here. It will be slightly over scale, otherwise you wouldn't even notice it. I had thought, you know, you could achieve the same, a very similar effect, at least if you make a mistake, you just wipe it off. Sorry, a very similar result, minus the stitching, but showing the tape, simply by masking and spraying a slightly different shade, and that of paint, and that would give the impression of tape where the tape wasn't there. You can use painting techniques like that very effectively. I have used it in railway modelling or model railwaying in the past, and a lot of people are fooled into thinking something's 3D when actually it's just a slightly different shade of paint. So I'm going to carry that on, and then when it's done you simply have to wait and let it dry. In my case it's probably going to be after I've had lunch, and then we'll have a little experiment. I think the micro pour or the blend dome might be just what we need because it isn't quite as thick as the iron-on covering. I'll carry on. You'll come back in a second. The glue's now dried and I'm sure you can see it, but if I tilt it you can see what happens. The little beads of glue sort of flatten out a little bit, and I'm going to try the blend dome. I've used this before and I think it works fairly well because it's not as thick as conventional covering would be. So if I move that in, I'm cutting a strip off a bit wider. I'm just eyeballing this, to be honest with you, what looks right. And this blend dome basically is a breathable medical tape, and the idea is I'll put it on and then seal it. I think that's a bit too wide actually. In fact, I'm just going to cut it a little bit off to check. It's one of the dangers of eyeballing it, I suppose. No, it's spot on, it's perfect. Better than I thought. So if I take this off now and then lay it over the top, and rub down, and what I will do is I'll seal this with a thin down coat of dope, and that'll seal in the tape. It's to seal the tape so it doesn't come off. I mean, it's glued, it's stuck on there now, but there you go. The layer of paint over the top will probably do that. I would put a tape, once I've done both sides, tape around the edge and tape along the rear, and because it's not pinked, it's fairly straightforward. But if you needed to do it pinked, you would simply draw a line and cut it with the scissors. What might lend itself better, you can get pinking wheels, so you would simply run the wheel along the line you wanted and you would get the pinking effect. So there you go. That's the effect that you get of stitched ribs. And I think it's negligible weight. It'll be a fraction of a gram for the whole model, but it makes a huge difference to the appearance. I'm a great believer in 90% of the effect for 10% of the effort. And what I'm doing with the models that I've been building recently, I don't consider myself a fine scale modeler. What I'm doing is I'm adding a few layers of depth to the models that I build to make them appear to be a more refined product than they actually are. The sports scale models with some additional detail that makes them just pop a little bit. And I think the stitching of the ribs is one of those examples where it does take a little bit of effort, but it's so much rewarded by the final appearance of the model. I hope you've enjoyed that. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, where have you been? Get subscribed and you can join in the fun. And let's all get creative. Bye now.